The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal drone as Katie Rodriguez pushed the supply cart down Seattle General's third-floor corridor, her movements efficient and practiced, the kind of invisible work that kept hospitals breathing. She moved between patient rooms with the precision of someone who had spent 23 years learning to exist in places without being truly seen. The cartwheel squeaked softly against the linoleum, a sound she barely registered anymore, part of the white noise that filled these halls alongside the ventilators and heart monitors and the 1,000 small beeps of machines keeping people alive. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, revealing a face that looked tired in the way that experienced nurses always look tired, not from the job itself, but from caring too much about it. No jewelry except a plain watch. No name badge on a lanyard. No photographs of family members taped to her locker. Katie Rodriguez had learned long ago that invisibility was a tactical advantage, whether you were in a Baghdad marketplace under sniper fire or restocking 4 bags in a Colorado Springs hospital. She could hear Dr. Mercer's voice carrying down the hall from the nursing station, that particular tone he used when he was on the phone with someone he wanted to impress. Smooth. Authoritative. Calculated to land like a compliment even when it was a knife. She didn't slow down, didn't acknowledge the voice, just checked the crash cart as she passed, muscle memory taking over, her hands verifying medications and defibrillator pads without conscious thought. The antiseptic smell of the hospital filled her nostrils, that sharp chemical bite mixed with something underneath it, something organic and vulnerable that all hospitals had. She touched the jacket in her locker 3 times that morning without really thinking about it, a ritual no one would recognize as anything but habit. Inside the lining, sewn with careful stitches 23 years old, was a faded unit patch. The symbol of the 5th Special Forces Group, worn during the surge, when everything that came after began. The intercom crackled somewhere above. A code somewhere in the building. Katie paused for exactly 2 seconds, listening, assessing, then continued her work. Not this floor. Not her station. Not yet. She had learned patience in places where impatience got you killed. The supply cart moved steadily, blue mesh filled with gauze and tape and saline flushes, the kind of supplies that kept people stabilized long enough to be saved. She restocked room 342, checking the oxygen setup, noting the patient in bed 1 was on a non-rebreather mask at 14 liters, his color better than yesterday. Room 344 had a post-op patient, 2 days out from hip replacement, vital signs steady. Room 345 had an empty bed with fresh linens. And then room 347. She knew before she rounded the corner that something was wrong in that room, had known since she'd caught the tail end of a conversation between 2 residents yesterday evening. The blind Special Forces veteran with the respiratory complications. The one no one wanted to touch. The one that doctors were calling a liability, a lawsuit waiting to happen, a case that would consume time and resources and probably end badly anyway. She'd heard the assessment in clinical terms, which meant she'd heard the rejection stripped of anything resembling compassion. The chart said his name was Marcus Rivera, 39 years old, admitted 72 hours ago with acute hypoxemia secondary to bilateral pneumonia and a history of post-traumatic stress disorder that apparently made him quote-unquote difficult to manage. 15 doctors. That was the number floating through the corridors like a curse. 15 attending physicians had already reviewed his case and walked away. Katie approached the vending machine on the 3rd floor at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, her hands moving through the motions of selecting a bag of chips she didn't particularly want, the mechanical gesture giving her something to do while her mind was somewhere else entirely. The machine hummed and clunked. The bag spiraled down. Her hand reached in to retrieve it with the kind of automatic efficiency that required no thought. And then she felt him before she heard him, the shift in air pressure that came with proximity, the scent of expensive cologne and something else underneath it, something that smelled like someone who had never been told no. Dr. Mercer. His coffee breath came first, then his voice, pitched low enough that only she could hear it, which somehow made it worse. You know, he said, standing close enough that she could see the cufflinks at his wrists, solid gold, expensive, the kind of thing a man wore when he wanted people to understand what he was worth. I think you might be happier at a clinic that valued enthusiasm over competence. Some place that saw your particular approach as an asset rather than a liability. Katie's hands remained perfectly steady as she retrieved her chips. She didn't turn toward him. She didn't acknowledge the words in any way that would give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Her jaw clenched once, a small muscle movement at her temple, but her face stayed neutral. Professional. The mask that had kept her alive through 1,000 moments of humiliation she had trained herself to endure. Security could probably help you arrange the transfer, Mercer continued, his voice taking on a lighter quality now, almost conversational. They're very efficient about escorting people out who make other physicians uncomfortable with their presence. Your consistent tendency to question protocol, to suggest that perhaps your assessment of a situation might be relevant, it's creating tension among the attending staff. Katie moved away from the vending machine without a word. Her fingers closed around the bag of chips. She walked back to the supply cart waiting in the corridor, her pace steady and controlled, the kind of pace that came from having learned to move through hostile environments without drawing attention. Mercer remained at the vending machine, watching her go, waiting perhaps for some sign that his words had landed. He would be waiting a very long time. The supply closet was where she went at 4:45, just before the shift change, a small room on the 4th floor near the oncology ward that nobody used anymore since they'd renovated the main supply area on the 2nd floor. The light flickered when she switched it on, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. Industrial shelving held boxes of gauze and rolls of tape and packages of sterile gloves, all organized with military precision. She stood alone between the shelves and pulled out her phone, the secure line that would connect her directly to Fort Carson if she needed it, the one number she'd never actually dialed in 2 years of being placed here. But what she held in her hands instead was the patient chart from room 347, which she had pulled from the system using her access code. Marcus Rivera. Special Forces. Blind. Respiratory failure pending. Her fingers traced the name tattooed on his forearm in the photograph that had been taken during his admission intake. Rodriguez. The same name as hers, though that meant nothing in a country where 50% of Special Forces operators named Rodriguez had served in the same units, been through the same training pipeline, bled the same blood into the same sand. But the tattoo was dated. The style was specific. The placement on his forearm meant he'd had it done after deployment, and there were only certain units that tattooed their names in that particular location, that particular font. The 5th Special Forces Group. Bravo Company. Baghdad Marketplace. 23 years ago. She stood there in the supply closet with a patient chart in her hands and a name that belonged to someone she hadn't thought about in more than 2 decades, someone she'd thought she'd left behind with her uniform and her rank and her old life. A man whose blood had soaked through her uniform as she'd carried him through the streets with sniper fire ripping the air around her head. 7 blocks. His weight impossible and necessary at the same time. His breathing wet and panicked against her neck. The marketplace roaring behind them, the screams of civilians, the hiss of gunfire. And then the aid station. And then the field hospital. And then the evacuation. And then she'd never seen him again, had never known if he'd made it, had never asked, because asking meant remembering, and remembering meant carrying something home that shouldn't be carried into civilian life. He didn't know who she was. He couldn't see her face. He probably didn't remember, or if he did, he remembered her as she'd been then, 23 years old, combat medic, young enough that her bones still felt like they might hold her up forever. Not as she was now. 39 years old. Wearing scrubs instead of body armor. Working as a nurse instead of a soldier. Invisible in the hallways of a Colorado hospital, carrying a secret that could destroy her if anyone knew it was a secret at all. She traced his name on the chart with her finger, not touching the paper, just following the letters with her eyes. Marcus Rivera. The man she'd saved once. The man 15 doctors had already abandoned. The man who was about to stop breathing if someone didn't do something, and that someone, apparently, was her. The supply closet light flickered again, casting her face in shadow for 1 second, then light, then shadow again. In the darkness between the fluorescent pulses, Katie Rodriguez made a decision that would start a chain of events no one at Seattle General was prepared to handle. She tucked the chart under her arm, turned off the light, and walked out of the supply closet with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world had to offer. What she didn't know was how little time she had left. The midnight shift stretched like taffy under fluorescent lights that hummed their endless mechanical prayer. Katie had been a nurse at Seattle General for 8 months, but tonight felt different, thinner somehow, like the walls were holding their breath. Room 347 occupied the corner of the third-floor cardiac wing. She'd been assigned a blind veteran without explanation, without the usual courtesy rounds, without any physician willing to stand between her and him. 15. She'd counted the refusal letters that afternoon. 15 attending physicians with nearly identical language, as if they'd read from the same script written in Mercer's handwriting. Dr. Patterson. Dr. Kim. Dr. Okonkwo. Dr. Chen. Dr. Reeves. The list went on like a jury returning a unanimous verdict of abandonment. The charge nurse had apologized with her eyes. "We're short," she'd said, which meant, no one else is stupid enough to take this assignment. Katie walked into room 347 at 11:08 p.m. with a blood pressure cuff and the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world had to offer. The veteran lay motionless on his back, his unseeing eyes fixed on the acoustic ceiling tiles. His name was Rodriguez, a name she'd carried in her bones for 16 years since a marketplace in Baghdad where the air tasted like copper and diesel exhaust. She didn't let herself look at his face for more than a second. The vitals were wrong. Not catastrophically wrong yet, but wrong in the way that makes a trained medic's spine straighten. His chest rose with the asymmetric motion of a man working too hard to breathe. His neck veins distended like he was valsalvaing against resistance that didn't exist. The pulse oximeter read 91%, down from 94 an hour ago despite the nasal cannula at 2 liters. His respiratory rate sat at 32, climbing with each shallow breath. Katie stood at the bedside for 10 seconds, running the clinical calculus that lived in the part of her brain that had dragged wounded soldiers through sandstorms and improvised surgical suites in abandoned schools. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, building pressure with each breath, collapsing the lung, shifting the mediastinum, strangling the heart's ability to fill. She'd seen it 3 times in her life. Once in a Humvee 20 seconds after an IED detonated beneath the chassis. Twice in field hospitals where the only treatment was a needle and steady hands. She checked his trachea. Shifted. Right deviation. Maybe 5 millimeters, maybe not enough for the untrained eye to notice. More than enough for death. His eyes moved beneath closed lids. She didn't know if he dreamed or if the darkness was absolute. Katie walked to the medication room with the measured pace of someone who had never broken protocol in her entire nursing career. She'd followed orders in Baghdad. She'd followed orders at Fort Carson. She'd followed orders for 8 months at Seattle General while Dr. Mercer built his empire on phantom consultations and patients too vulnerable to question their statements. She would not follow orders tonight. The emergency airway kit sat on the 3rd shelf, right side, exactly where regulations required it to be. She selected a 14-gauge needle, large bore, silver, the kind of simple geometry that separates breathing from drowning. Her hands moved with the fluid precision of muscle memory being another name for survival. She'd performed this procedure twice in the field, once on a staff sergeant whose lung was collapsing under the weight of Baghdad's heat and blood loss. Once on herself during combat medicine certification, a clinical instructor with a balloon pump demonstrating that she could keep herself alive if the situation demanded it. The situation was demanding it now. Back in room 347, she closed the door with the quiet click of someone accustomed to working in silence. The veteran didn't stir. His breathing had become a visible labor, each inhalation a negotiation with physics he was losing. The pulse oximeter cast its red glow across his face, a face that was somehow older and younger than the one she remembered from before he lost his eyes, before the world went black for him in ways that had nothing to do with darkness. She found the second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Just below the clavicle, that bony ridge where she drilled this procedure 1,000 times on mannequins and twice on living tissue. Her left hand steadied his chest. Her right hand held the needle with the kind of absolute certainty that comes from knowing the alternative was unacceptable. The needle advanced through skin, through fascia, through the intercostal muscles that protected the space between his ribs. She felt the subtle resistance of tissue, then the sudden release as the needle penetrated the parietal pleura into the pleural space where air was never meant to exist. The rush came like a sigh, a hiss of pressurized air escaping, the sound of a tire deflating in reverse, the sound of a lung remembering how to expand. She could hear it in the room, feel it in her hands, see it in the immediate change in his chest wall as the tension released and his lungs could finally fill properly. The pulse oximeter beeped. 72%. 78%. 85%. 91%. 94%. Climbing. The number her eyes had been waiting for. His breathing slowed. His neck veins descended. His chest began to move symmetrically again, the desperate labor replaced by the quiet mechanics of a lung that was no longer drowning. Katie left the needle in place, standard protocol for decompression, keep it there in case the air reaccumulated, and stepped back from the bedside. She could hear him breathing now, really breathing, the kind of deep measured breaths that belong to living people instead of people circling the drain. She should have called a physician immediately. That was the protocol. That was what you did when you performed an emergency procedure without orders. You called the attending. You explained yourself. You accepted the consequences of choosing the patient over the hierarchy. She walked out of room 347 at 12:04 a.m. and made it as far as the medication room before stopping. By morning, everything had changed. The incident reports arrived before dawn, 3 of them, each meticulously documented in Dr. Mercer's handwriting with the kind of clinical precision that made Katie understand he'd been waiting for this moment. Unauthorized invasive procedure. Nursing staff practicing medicine without supervision. Dangerous deviation from established protocol in direct violation of hospital policy. He'd also filed a request to reassign the veteran to the 4th floor. Done. Completed at 6:17 a.m., before day shift even started. She checked the chart and the bed was empty, the unit patch, the faded emblem of a unit she'd bled for in a marketplace where the sun never stopped burning, gone with him. Her computer access was restricted by 7:27 a.m. The medical records system locked her out mid-password with a message she would see 1,000 times before Friday, access denied. 8 months of work. 8 months of documenting Mercer's phantom consultations, his impossible billing codes, his systematic theft from the VA system by charging for procedures never performed on patients who couldn't advocate for themselves because they were too sick, too blind, too broken to question whether the appointments in their charts actually happened. All of it locked behind a screen she no longer had permission to see. Katie sat in the break room with a coffee she didn't drink and a composure that had been drilled into her since she was 23 years old and carrying a wounded soldier through streets where buildings were collapsing like dominoes. She'd been trained to hold still when everything was burning. She'd been trained to show nothing when inside everything was screaming. The termination hearing was scheduled for Friday. 3 business days. She could feel the trap closing, could see the architecture of Mercer's escalation now that she understood the depth of his competence. He hadn't just filed complaints. He'd built a narrative. He'd created an official record that made her look reckless, dangerous, exactly the kind of nurse who needed to be removed from patient care before she hurt someone. And now she had no access to the evidence that proved he was the actual danger in this building, not the nurse who'd saved a life, but the doctor who'd been systematically stealing from every blind veteran, every wounded soldier, every person too vulnerable to defend themselves against a system that was supposed to heal them. The clock in the break room ticked forward. Somewhere on the 4th floor, the blind veteran was breathing on his own, his lung expanded, his oxygen saturation probably normal again. He didn't know why he was alive. He didn't know who'd saved him. He didn't know that the person who'd pulled him out of a Baghdad marketplace 16 years ago had just sacrificed her cover, her career, and 8 months of classified investigation to make sure he got to take another breath. By morning, Mercer had already filed 3 separate incident reports. Katie didn't know this yet. She was still in the supply closet at 7 a.m., holding the blind veteran's chart like it was the last piece of evidence she'd ever get to touch. Her hands were perfectly steady. They always were. 16 years of combat training made sure of that. Hands that had applied tourniquets under sniper fire didn't shake over paperwork, no matter what the paperwork meant. The hiss of air escaping the needle had been unmistakable. Textbook. She'd positioned it at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, exactly where the trauma surgery rotation at Fort Sam Houston had taught her in 2007, and the moment the needle passed through the parietal pleura, the pressure differential had released like an exhale she'd been holding for 16 years. His oxygen saturation had climbed from 87 to 94 in 40 seconds. His trachea had shifted back toward midline. His breathing had eased. The numbers didn't lie. The numbers never lied. Dr. Morrison had arrived at 12:24 a.m., 12 minutes after she'd paged him. He'd seen the decompression needle already in place between the veteran's ribs, had examined the patient with the kind of quiet precision that meant he knew exactly what he was looking at, and had asked a single question in a voice like ice water poured into a glass: "Did you wait for orders?" "No, sir," Katie had said. He had approximately 90 seconds before cardiac arrest. Breath sounds absent on the left. Tracheal deviation. Distended neck veins. "I made the call." Morrison had examined the patient for another 30 seconds without speaking. Then he'd placed the chest tube, size 32 French pigtail catheter, correct depth, confirmed by chest X-ray at 1 a.m., and he'd left the room still without another word. Katie had documented everything in precise clinical language, timestamps exact to the minute, interventions justified by vital signs, outcome positive, patient stable. She'd finished her shift at 7 a.m., changed into street clothes in the locker room, and driven home expecting nothing except maybe a formal meeting with the nursing supervisor about scope of practice boundaries. Instead, when she'd arrived for her next shift Wednesday evening, her badge wouldn't scan at the security entrance. The badge reader had beeped 3 times. Red light. Access denied. The security guard, a man whose name she'd never learned despite for months of nodding at him every shift, looked genuinely uncomfortable. "You need to check with HR," he'd said, sliding the badge back across the counter like it was contaminated. The charge nurse wouldn't meet her eyes in the hallway. "They've been looking for you all day," she'd said. "3rd floor. Ask for Director Chen." The HR office was exactly where Katie knew it would be, because she'd spent 8 months learning every camera placement, every restricted access point, every administrative procedure at Seattle General. She'd memorized the building the way she'd memorized Iraqi city blocks before deployment. The way soldiers learn terrain. Now that same knowledge felt like a prison. 3 incident reports were spread across Director Chen's desk, all dated Wednesday morning. Unauthorized medical procedure. Practicing medicine without supervision. Endangering patient safety through reckless intervention. The language was formal, clinical, absolutely devastating. Dr. Mercer had made calls Tuesday evening. Katie learned this later, would piece it together from fragments of conversation overheard in the cafeteria, from a sympathetic resident who'd heard Mercer on the phone in his office saying things like dangerous cowboy nurse and practicing medicine, and I've already informed the board. 15 doctors had already refused the patient based on Mercer's warnings that he was litigious and unstable. Now Mercer was protecting his position by making sure the one nurse who'd actually helped him couldn't gather any more evidence. "Your termination hearing is scheduled for Friday at 9 a.m., Director Chen said. She was reading from a script, professional distance in every word. "Your computer access has been suspended as of 7 a.m. Wednesday. Your locker contents are in this box. We'll need your badge at this time." Katie handed it over. The badge was still warm from where she'd been holding it. Plastic ID with her photograph, taken 3 years ago when she'd applied for the position as nursing staff, when her entire life had been a carefully constructed lie designed to sit in this hospital and gather evidence of a man she'd never met stealing from people who couldn't see well enough to question the bills. She'd spent 8 months documenting it. 8 months watching Mercer bill the VA for consultations he'd never performed, procedures he'd coded to vulnerable veterans, men and women who'd survived combat but couldn't survive the American healthcare system. The blind veteran in room 347 had been one of 17 patients she'd identified. 17 separate billing schemes. Each one traceable. Each one criminal. And now she couldn't access any of it. The box of her locker contents was heavier than she expected. A cardigan she kept for shifts that ran past midnight. A half-empty jar of peanut butter from lunch breaks. A photograph of her son from his 14th birthday, now 2 years old. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the 3rd Battalion 5th Marines insignia she'd worn in Baghdad, now hidden where only she could feel it. The patch was the only thing in the box that actually mattered. Everything else was just the costume of a woman named Katie Rodriguez, Army nurse, divorced mother, 39 years old, with no security clearance and no way to prove what she'd spent 8 months learning. "Is there anything else?" Director Chen asked. She was already looking at her computer, already moving on to the next termination, the next box of personal effects. "When does the hearing take place?" Katie asked. Her voice was steady. She'd trained it to be steady. A voice that sounded like it had nowhere to go and nothing to prove. "Friday. 9 a.m. Conference Room B, 3rd floor. You're welcome to bring representation." Director Chen didn't look up. "You can go." The drive home took 42 minutes. Katie knew this because she counted them. Counted the red lights. Counted the streets. Counted the minutes like she was counting something that could be saved if she just counted hard enough. The rain started somewhere around mile marker 7, hammering the windshield like applause for a performance nobody wanted to watch. She passed the turnoff to Fort Carson. She passed the turnoff to the VA hospital where they treated veterans like the blind man in room 347. She kept driving straight. Her house was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that faced the street so she could see when her son came home from school. He was there when she walked through the door at 6:08 p.m., sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, doing homework or pretending to do homework. At 16, it was hard to tell the difference. He looked up when she dropped her keys on the counter. "Why are you home?" he asked. Katie sat at the kitchen table. She didn't remove her jacket. She didn't remove her shoes. She just sat there and let the first tears come, and somewhere in the back of her mind, the part of her that was still Captain Rodriguez, 3rd Battalion 5th Marines, sat up and took notice. She hadn't cried since his father's funeral. For years. For years of training, of investigation, of holding the line. For years of being the person who didn't cry, who didn't break, who didn't give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her bend. The tears were hot. The tears were real. The tears meant she'd lost. Her son closed his laptop. He came and sat beside her at the kitchen table. He didn't ask questions. He was old enough to know when to wait. At 16, he'd already learned that some things couldn't be rushed. Some things had to be allowed to happen. "I got fired," Katie said. It was the simplest truth she could find. Everything else was classified, encrypted, sealed behind government NDAs and military security protocols. Everything else was something she couldn't say. "The veteran I told you about. The one I've been taking care of. I did something the hospital didn't approve of. They're making an example of me." "Is he okay?" her son asked. "The veteran. He's alive." That much was true. That much was certain. "I got him to the next step. He'll have his chance." Her son was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Katie heard the fluorescent lights in the kitchen humming their mechanical song. Long enough that she heard the rain on the roof, hammering like it had a purpose. Long enough that she understood what it meant to have a child old enough to understand that sometimes doing the right thing costs more than you could afford to pay. "What happens now?" he asked. Katie looked at the kitchen table. She looked at her hands. She looked at the jacket hanging on the back of the chair with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, invisible to everyone except the person who knew to look for it. she looked at her son's face and realized that he'd never known her as anything except the person sitting in front of him right now, a nurse named Katie, a mother who came home tired, a woman who'd spent 8 months protecting a stranger because it was the right thing to do. What she didn't tell him was that staying silent meant losing 8 months of evidence. What she didn't tell him was that walking away from this job meant losing access to the billing records, the falsified consultations, the 17 victims whose cases she'd documented with meticulous precision. What she didn't tell him was that a single encrypted call to Fort Carson could change everything, could bring in Army intelligence, could trigger investigations, could expose the fraud she'd been gathering evidence against since the moment she'd arrived at Seattle General. But that call came with a cost. That call meant revealing Captain Katie Rodriguez to the world. That call meant explaining to her 16-year-old son that his entire life had been the cover story for a military operation he'd never agreed to be part of. She sat at the kitchen table with tears running down her face, the first time he'd seen her cry since his father's funeral, and realized that she was out of time. The hearing was Friday. Friday at 9 a.m., she was supposed to defend a nursing career that didn't actually exist. But something else was happening now. Something was beginning to move in the background, something that had been waiting for her to make exactly this kind of mistake. Something that couldn't be stopped now that she'd triggered it by saving a veteran's life when she was supposed to stay quiet and invisible. She didn't know it yet, but in exactly 48 hours, a 2-star general from the Pentagon would walk into a hospital conference room and change everything. Katie's son walked into the administrator's office Friday morning carrying a shadow box like he was bearing the flag at Arlington. The medals caught the fluorescent light, silver and bronze catching gold, and Martha Vance's breath hitched the moment she saw him. Katie stood to pull him back, but his voice was steady, 16 years old and absolute. "Mom," he said, ignoring the administrator's objection, "they need to see these." The termination hearing had convened at 9 a.m. sharp. For people seated around a table meant for 20. Martha Vance at the head with Katie's empty personnel file spread before her like a crime scene. Dr. Mercer to her left, hospital counsel beside him in a grey suit that cost more than Katie's monthly mortgage. Katie alone on the opposite side, hands folded, face neutral as surgical tape. Mercer had been midway through his presentation, something about unauthorized procedures and what he called cowboy nursing practices, when the door opened without a knock. Katie's son stepped inside like he'd walked into 1,000 conference rooms instead of his first one. He was tall for 16, had his father's shoulders, and he moved with a certainty that made Martha Vance's hand freeze mid-gesture. The shadow box was mahogany, the kind the military used, and the medals inside, Silver Star, 2 bronze stars, Purple Heart, threw light across his face like he was carrying something holy. "Mom." His voice didn't shake. "They need to see these." Katie started toward him, one hand raised, ready to explain, ready to pull him back into the hallway, ready to protect the mission that was no longer a mission. But a voice from the doorway cut through the room like a scalpel. "Reaper 6? The blind veteran stood in the frame, one hand on a guide's arm, his face turned toward her voice with absolute certainty. His scarred cheek caught the light. His jaw clenched like he was remembering something his eyes would never see again. The way he said her call sign, the one she hadn't heard spoken aloud since Baghdad, made the fluorescent light sound too loud, the air in the room too thin. Katie didn't move. Her hands remained at her sides. Her face stayed level. This was the moment the cover broke, the moment everything she'd built in 8 months of meticulous documentation became secondary to recognition, to being known by someone who'd watched her drag him through sniper fire while his blood soaked into her uniform. The security guard by the door, retired Marine Corps, 22 years, you could see it in the way he carried himself, went completely rigid. His eyes moved from Katie's son to the medals in the shadow box, and then to the inside of her jacket where the sleeve had shifted when she stood. The faded unit patch was visible there, sewn into the lining in olive drab thread, a 528th Medical Company patch worn soft from 17 years of being carried against her skin. The guard's spine straightened like someone had run a current through it. His hand rose to his chest, fingers curling into a salute before anyone in the room understood what he was seeing. Martha Vance picked up the citation card with hands that had begun to tremble. Her voice shook as she read, the the President of the United States takes pleasure in presenting the Silver Star Medal to Captain Katie Rodriguez, United States Army, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepid actions under fire while serving with the 528 ND Medical Company in Baghdad, Iraq. Dr. Mercer interrupted. His voice was sharp, a knife trying to cut through something he didn't understand yet. This is completely inappropriate. We're here to discuss her unauthorized medical procedures. This theater doesn't change. But Martha Vance kept reading, her voice stronger now, steadier, like the words themselves were giving her permission to continue. Captain Rodriguez distinguished herself by exceptionally valorous actions while under intense enemy fire in Baghdad, carrying a critically wounded Special Forces soldier 7 blocks through contested urban terrain despite her own injuries, sustaining the soldier's life through direct combat casualty care while engaging hostile forces. The blind veteran's voice cut through again, and it carried the weight of something that had lived in darkness for 3 years. She carried me. I couldn't see. But I remember her voice. She kept saying my name. She said it like I was worth saving. The room went dead silent. That was the moment. Not the medals. Not the rank. Not the revelation. The moment when a man who'd been invisible in his own blindness was finally, publicly, seen as someone worth the risk. Katie's jaw clenched once, then settled. Her composure held. Her hands remained steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind that builds pressure behind bone and skin. The conference room door opened without warning. A 2-star general in dress uniform entered like he owned the space, like he'd walked through walls more substantial than drywall and hospital policy to get here. Major General Pierce. Army dress blues that moved like water. Arriving exactly 48 hours after Katie had made a single encrypted call to Fort Carson from the supply closet, her voice low, her words clinical, mission compromise. Recommend immediate escalation. The general didn't shake Katie's hand. He didn't acknowledge the hospital counsel or Martha Vance. He walked directly to the shadow box, looked at the medals for 5 full seconds without touching them, and then saluted, a clean, precise movement that made the Marine security guard's breath catch. The salute hung there, formal and final, like the general was honoring not just medals but every invisible moment that had led to this room. When General Pierce lowered his hand, he turned to Martha Vance and spoke in a voice that sounded like a tank idling in a garage, all power held in restraint. I'm here representing the Pentagon Inspector General's office regarding Operation Enduring Freedom veteran billing practices at Seattle General Hospital. He placed a folder on the table. The folder was thick. We need to discuss Dr. Mercer's consultation claims for patients treated in this facility over the past 18 months. Mercer's face shifted. Not red. Worse than red. It went the color of something already dead. The general continued without looking at him. Captain Rodriguez has been operating under military intelligence cover at this facility for 8 months as part of a joint Army Criminal Investigation Division and FBI investigation into Medicare fraud targeting disabled and vulnerable veterans. Specifically, we're investigating 47 procedures you claim to perform on blind and severely disabled patients. General Pierce opened the folder. Pages of financial data. Billing codes. Patient names. According to the medical records of these patients, none of these procedures occurred. The patients themselves were not present during the times you billed for their care. In several cases, the patients were documented to be sedated in other facilities during your claimed procedures. The silence was absolute. No machines beeping. No pages calling code blues. No ventilator wheeze or rubber gloves snapping. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the weight of 47 lies becoming visible in a single moment. Katie's son watched her face, looking for permission to breathe. The blind veteran stood perfectly still, understanding something had shifted in the air, the way a person learns to feel pressure changes when their eyes can't be trusted. Martha Vance's hands had gone white-knuckled on the edge of the table. The hospital counsel was already reaching for his phone. General Pierce picked up another sheet. We've documented $847,000 in fraudulent Medicare claims involving veterans who could not verify procedures due to their disabilities. These are vulnerable patients, Dr. Mercer. Combat injured. Disabled. Unable to question medical billing statements. You targeted them specifically because they couldn't hold you accountable. He set the paper down like it was evidence in a trial that had already been decided. The investigation you initiated into Captain Rodriguez's credentials led our forensic accountants directly to your billing anomalies. Your own attempts to discredit her created the digital trail we needed. So thank you for that. Mercer stood. His mouth opened. His hand reached for something, words, maybe, or justification, or the last shred of the power he'd been wielding like a weapon for 18 months. But there was nothing left to reach for. The room had already changed. The silence had changed. The fact of his own competence, his ability to hide the fraud, his skill at intimidation, his mastery of hospital politics, had become evidence against him instead of armor. Katie remained standing, face neutral, hands steady. This was the moment her 17 years of compartmentalization met the surface. This was the moment the quiet nurse with perfect charting and a cautious demeanor became visible as something else entirely. Captain. Investigator. Survivor. The woman who'd carried a bleeding soldier through Baghdad without flinching, who'd performed an emergency needle decompression without calling for permission, who'd let herself be fired to protect the mission because that's what you did when the people you served were worth more than your cover. Her son set the shadow box down on the conference table and walked around to stand beside her. He didn't ask permission. He just moved into position like he'd known his whole life where he belonged in this particular moment. The blind veteran turned his face toward her, and even without eyes that worked, his recognition was complete. The general saluted once more, and not her directly, but the space between them, the sacrifice that occupied that space. General Pierce turned to Martha Vance. The Pentagon will be taking custody of all billing records and medical documentation from this facility related to Dr. Mercer's practice. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division will be conducting interviews with all staff members who may have knowledge of these billing practices. And Captain Rodriguez will be reinstated with back pay, full clearance, and an official commendation in her personnel file. He paused. His eyes moved to Mercer with the kind of attention predators give prey that's already finished running. Dr. Mercer will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The folding metal chairs scraped against linoleum as people stood without meaning to, as the geometry of the room reorganized itself around new information and old power structures collapsing. Katie's son gripped her hand. The blind veteran smiled, really smiled, for the first time in 3 years. And Katie kept her composure, kept her hand steady, kept her face level as the wall she'd built between her two lives came down like controlled demolition, loud enough that no one would ever put them back up again. Dr. Mercer's attorney leaned forward to request a recess, but General Pierce shook his head once, a movement economical and final. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a federal notification that warrants were being prepared. The general's uniform carried the weight of 2 stars and 38 years of command authority, and he'd arrived with FBI investigators who were already searching Mercer's office while he sat trapped in this conference room, unable to move, unable to call anyone, unable to do anything but watch his career atomize in real time. The investigating officers had found the ledgers within 20 minutes. Physical files tucked in a locked drawer behind medical journals, 15 separate Medicare submission records for procedures never performed on veterans who couldn't see well enough to question their statements. The fraud had a rhythm to it. A consultation billed at $3,400. A follow-up appointment that never happened, charged to the VA at $1,850. A procedure code for wound assessment, $2,100, submitted for patients still in their initial evaluation phase. Repeat across months, across years, across 47 different disabled veterans, each one flagged in the VA system with disabilities that made them easy targets for an ambitious physician who understood that blind men couldn't verify their own medical records. Katie watched Mercer's face cycle through the stages of collapse, denial first, then anger, then a terrible calculation as he realized the scope of exposure. His attorney was whispering something about administrative errors, but the numbers didn't allow for error. $2,143,000 over 3 years of Operation Enduring Freedom veteran cases. Federal prosecutors had been building this case for 2 years before Katie ever walked through Seattle General's doors. Her 8 months of evidence just accelerated the timeline. Mercer tried to argue that Katie was unstable, that her emergency procedure had been unauthorized, that she'd violated protocol and he was simply protecting the institution. CEO Vance cut him off mid-sentence, her voice flat as antiseptic. "Dr. Mercer, you're suspended effective immediately pending the federal investigation. Security will escort you from the building." The hospital guards who appeared in the doorway weren't there to protect him, they were there to ensure compliance. His clearance was being revoked. His license was under review. His future had just acquired an expiration date measured in hours. The next 6 months blurred past in testimony and depositions. Katie's cover was blown completely, her identity as Captain Katie Rodriguez declassified across multiple federal agencies, her years of undercover service now entered into the public record. But her documentation was airtight. Every notation she'd made about Mercer's billing patterns, every suspicious entry cross-referenced with patient charts, every discrepancy she'd flagged and quietly reported to Army intelligence, it all came together in a prosecution package that moved with the crushing inevitability of a tank rolling across open ground. 15 veterans came forward with their own billing statements. Each one held a statement for consultations they never received, procedures never performed, follow-up appointments that were phantom entries in a system designed to trust physicians. A 68-year-old man with traumatic brain injury had been billed for a neurological evaluation he didn't attend. A 52-year-old woman who'd lost both legs had been charged for a mobility assessment by a physician she'd never met. And 71-year-old veteran with Parkinson's disease had been billed for speech therapy sessions that his actual therapist said never occurred. 15 veterans. 47 fraudulent billing codes. $2 million extracted from the military healthcare system designed to serve the people who'd given the most. Katie was reassigned to Fort Carson in Colorado Springs with a formal commendation for undercover work in support of federal criminal investigation. Her security clearance was reinstated at a higher level. The hospital issued a public apology that CEO Vance personally delivered, acknowledging that Dr. Mercer had orchestrated Katie's termination to prevent her from documenting his illegal activities. She received a settlement that she donated to the nonprofit supporting blind veterans. Her son transferred schools mid-year. He grumbled about leaving his friends, about the new district, about having to start over in January when the social hierarchies were already established, but secretly he wore the information like armor. His mom was Captain Rodriguez. His mom saved lives while undercover. His mom brought down a criminal doctor. By March, everyone at his new school knew who his mother was. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb underwent emergency surgery at University of Colorado Hospital, a procedure that addressed the respiratory cascade Mercer had ignored. A cardiothoracic surgeon spent for hours reconstructing the damaged airway tissues, and the recovery was long enough to give Webb time to understand what he'd been denied. His vision partially returned in his left eye, not full sight, but enough to see shapes and faces in bright light, enough to read large print documents with magnification, enough to see photographs clearly for the first time in 7 years. Enough to know what his rescuer looked like now. 6 months after the termination hearing that never concluded because there was nothing left to defend, Katie returned to Seattle General for a follow-up meeting with the Inspector General's office. The investigation was complete. The prosecution was moving forward. Her role was officially concluded. She was walking through the loading dock area behind the hospital when she saw a medical supply van parked at the delivery entrance, unmarked except for a small company logo on the side, and Dr. Mercer emerged from the driver's seat wearing a blue uniform with his name stitched over the pocket in white thread. He was carrying boxes of gauze and syringes from the van, moving with the careful, small movements of a man who understood that his world had compressed to the size of a delivery route. Recognition crossed his face immediately when he looked up, the moment stretched thin between them, him in his blue uniform, her in civilian clothes with captain's bars visible on her jacket collar for the first time since going undercover. His face flushed red, not with anger but with something closer to the complete absence of options. He said nothing. He loaded the supplies onto a hand truck with deliberate care, his jaw moving like he was grinding something to powder. Katie didn't speak to him, didn't acknowledge him beyond a single glance, and continued walking because his destruction was already complete. There was no satisfaction in witnessing it further. The pediatric ward stood exactly as she remembered it, children's artwork on the walls, a mural of mountains and sky that someone had painted years ago. Katie stood in that space 6 months after Mercer's suspension, wearing civilian clothes with her captain's bars finally visible on her jacket collar, and the hospital had invited her back for a ceremony honoring her service. CEO Vance made a speech about courage and integrity that Katie tolerated with her usual composure, her jaw level, her breathing steady. The room held 47 people, exactly the number of veterans Mercer had defrauded, one person for each case, and they'd written letters that Vance read aloud. Letters about trust restored, about vision returning, about knowing that someone had actually cared enough to dig deeper. Her son sat in the front row next to Staff Sergeant Webb, whose vision had improved enough that he could see the stage with clarity. Webb wore his dress uniform. He'd driven down from Denver for this, taken leave from his job at the Veterans Hospital, made a point of being present for the woman who'd saved him twice. Afterward, the three of them stood together near the pediatric ward's front window, afternoon light streaming across their faces, examining the faded unit patch that Katie had finally removed from the inside of her jacket lining. The 528th Medical Company insignia was worn thin from years of hidden carrying, the embroidery threads dulled by time and moisture and the pressure of being pressed against her heart. Webb's fingers traced the stitching with the care of someone reading Braille. Slow. Reverent. I got your name tattooed a week after Baghdad, he said quietly. I couldn't see your face in the Humvee, but I heard you say it when you were carrying me. Rodriguez. I thought you were a guy. Katie's son laughed, surprised, and even Katie smiled slightly, a real smile that touched her eyes. Webb held the patch up to the light filtering through the window, comparing it to a photograph someone had taken in Baghdad 16 years ago. A young combat medic with blood on her uniform and exhaustion etched into her frame, standing next to a makeshift aid station with her hand on a wounded soldier's shoulder. Katie and Webb, decades collapsed into a single frame. You saved my life twice, Webb said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who understood the cost of that rescue. Once when everyone was watching, and once when no one was. Katie took the patch back, running her thumb over the embroidery with hands that had held lives together more times than she could count. That's the thing about heroism, she said quietly, her voice steady as it had been since Baghdad. The real kind happens in the middle of the night when there's no one there to see it except the person who needs you. Her son posted the photograph online that evening with a caption his mother would never write herself, the young medic and the older nurse, the same hands, 16 years between them. The image went viral within hours, shared across military networks and veteran communities, thousands of people suddenly understanding that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everything together. The video captured Katie's closing words delivered directly to camera, her expression neutral but her voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd seen the absolute worst and chosen to serve anyway. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. The screen faded to black on her face, finally visible, finally known, and the faded unit patch resting on the table between her and the soldier she'd saved twice, a decade of service written in threads that would never fray because some bonds don't break. They just get stronger. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another episode of The Code Whisperers. Leave a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And share this with someone who needs to know that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform on the outside.